two tiny German Shepherd puppies, buried beneath the drifts, their whimpers swallowed by the wind. No one was meant to find them there. But down that same frozen road, a Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole was running from ghosts of his own, driving through the snow with nothing left to save. The war had ended, but inside him, the battle never did. Until that night, when two small lives flickered in the white silence, and something deep inside him, long thought dead, began to breathe again. What followed would prove that even the coldest ground can still remember warmth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The last week of January arrived in Vermont like a long-held breath. Cold, heavy, and unwilling to let go. The snow had fallen for 3 days straight, burying fences, silencing rivers, and pressing the world into a kind of sacred stillness. It was in that silence, on a narrow back road outside the town of Haverhill, that Ethan Cole drove his old gray pickup, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the blizzard. Once, he had driven armored vehicles through deserts that glowed with heat. Now he drove through a land where even sound seemed frozen. Ethan was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still carrying the discipline of the Navy SEAL he once was. His dark brown hair had begun to show faint streaks of gray, and a trimmed beard shadowed a face carved by both weather and memory. His steel blue eyes were the kind that had seen too much, eyes that rarely looked directly at people anymore. He had moved to Vermont a year earlier, hoping the quiet might wash away the noise still echoing in his head. It hadn't. His cabin sat a mile from the nearest paved road, tucked between pines and birch. The only sound he heard most nights was wind slipping through the trees and the dull tick of the small heater that struggled to keep the place warm. That night, though, the heater was silent. The power had gone out hours ago. He had driven into town earlier for supplies and was returning home when he saw movement. A shape huddled beside the snowbank, small and trembling. At first he thought it was just wind-stirring debris, but when his headlights swung across the drift, he saw two tiny bodies pressed together inside a half-broken wooden box. The pups were German Shepherds, no more than 6 weeks old, their fur stiff with ice, their breaths shallow. Ethan stopped the truck and stepped out into the storm. The wind bit his face, slicing through his jacket. He crouched, gloved hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden, unexpected rush of life before him. He lifted one pup gently. Its fur was coarse, dark tan with streaks of black, and one paw hung limp as if frozen. The other, smaller, had paler fur and eyes barely open, blinking through ice crystals. Ethan could feel faint warmth under their coats, fragile as a candle. "Who left you here?" he murmured, voice hoarse from disuse. The sound of his own words startled him. It had been days since he'd spoken aloud. He carried the box into the truck and placed it on the passenger seat, turning the heat on full blast. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing hard, watching frost melt off their fur. Then he pressed the accelerator, the tires slipping on ice before gripping the road again. Back at the cabin, he set them down beside the wood stove, which he reignited using matches and dry pine logs. The flames caught slowly, throwing thin golden light across the room. The cabin was modest. One small bed, a table littered with coffee mugs, and shelves lined with tools and maps. On one wall hung a framed photograph of men in desert fatigues, smiling beside a dusty military vehicle. Ethan never looked at it for long. The pups whimpered softly. He grabbed an old towel, rubbing them until their fur began to loosen from stiffness. "Hang in there," he whispered. You made it this far." He remembered saying the same thing once to a wounded soldier in Afghanistan just before the medevac arrived. Except that time, the man hadn't made it. The memory hit him like a cold wave, and he had to stand, pressing a hand to his forehead until the rush of guilt passed. When the pups finally stopped shaking, they curled together near the stove. Ethan mixed warm milk and water, feeding them with a small syringe he'd found in his emergency kit. The darker one drank greedily. The smaller hesitated, then licked weakly at the edge. "You're fighters," he said. "Guess that makes 3 of us." As the night wore on, the storm eased, and exhaustion took hold. Ethan sat in his old recliner, staring at the 2 tiny forms asleep beside the fire. Their steady breathing filled the cabin like the sound of a clock long broken, but still trying to tick. For the first time in months, his mind went quiet. Not the silence of avoidance, but a calm that came from simply watching something alive. Before sleep took him, he looked down at them again. "Ash," he murmured, touching the darker pup's head. "And you, River." The smaller one's tail twitched, as if in reply. Outside, the wind slowed to a whisper. The forest, blanketed in white, stood utterly still. Underneath that frozen layer, the ground held secrets of its own. Seeds, bones, and sometimes memories. At the same hour, several miles away, Margaret Hale sat in her kitchen, looking out through frosted glass toward her garden. She was 68, tall and lean, her silver hair tied in a low knot. Her hands were marked by years of chalk dust and gardening soil. Once a high school literature teacher, she'd retired after her son Daniel was killed during a covert mission overseas. The telegram had come 12 years ago, delivered by 2 men in uniform who couldn't meet her eyes. Every evening, she followed a ritual, lighting a candle by the window, then walking to the small birch tree in her backyard. The tree was young, its trunk pale and smooth, grown from a sapling she and Daniel had planted together the summer before he left for deployment. When the ground thawed each spring, she wrote him letters on thick paper, letters she never mailed, then buried them in a tin box at the base of that tree. The snow around it tonight glowed faintly under the candlelight from her window. She thought about the stranger she'd seen in town earlier that week, a man with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone used to command. He'd bought supplies and left without saying more than a polite nod. There had been something haunted in his eyes. She wondered where he lived, what ghosts he carried. Back at the cabin, the fire dimmed. Ethan stirred, shivering under the thin blanket draped across his knees. He hadn't dreamed, but the silence itself felt thick enough to hold memory. He walked to the window, peering out into the pale dawn. The storm had passed. A low fog hugged the tree line, and the snow shone blue under the first light. Then he saw it, just beyond the porch, where he had dumped the last load of dirt he'd brought back from Afghanistan. A small patch of soil he'd never touched again. A thin green shoot pierced through the snow. It was impossible. The ground was frozen solid, yet something was growing. He opened the door, the cold biting into his face, and stepped outside. The sprout trembled slightly in the breeze, fragile but alive. Ethan crouched down, staring at it. The stem was pale and slender, its 2 tiny leaves spread open like a heartbeat caught mid-motion. He brushed snow away and whispered, "How?" But no one answered. Inside, the 2 puppies stirred and began to whine. Ethan looked back toward them, then at the sprout again. He thought of Margaret's son, of the photo on his wall, of the desert that still lived behind his eyes. The seed must have been among the handful of soil he'd carried home from that place, something Daniel had once touched, maybe even buried himself. Ethan stood there for a long time, breath fogging in the cold morning air. The sun was rising behind the mountains, turning the snow from gray to gold. He felt an ache in his chest. Not pain, not yet healing. Just the first tremor of something beginning again. He whispered into the quiet, as if to the air, to the dogs, to the dead. Guess you found a way to come home after all. Behind him, the puppies barked softly, and for a moment, the world felt almost alive again. Morning came slow and pale, a wash of light that turned the snow outside Ethan Cole's cabin into an unbroken sea of silver. The fire in the stove had burned low during the night, and the air inside carried the faint metallic bite of cold iron. Ethan stirred awake in the recliner, his back stiff, a wool blanket fallen to the floor. The two puppies were still asleep beside the hearth. Ash stretched out like a miniature guard, River curled tightly against his flank. Their breathing made tiny clouds in the chill. For a long time, Ethan didn't move. The quiet pressed in on him the way silence used to in desert ambushes. Too perfect, too complete, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He rose and opened the door. The storm had erased the road entirely. The snow reached his shins, and the trees stood frozen like statues. The small sprout from the night before was still there, impossibly alive, a sliver of green against the white. Ethan crouched beside it, brushing away more snow. Beneath the surface, the soil was dark and oddly warm. He pressed his glove against it and felt, not heat exactly, but something steady, like a pulse. His gaze drifted toward the slope behind the cabin where he had buried a handful of objects the week he arrived here. An old knife, a bullet casing, and the dog tag of Daniel Hale, his teammate, his friend, and the man he hadn't been able to save. Inside, Ash barked softly. River stumbled toward the doorway, her paws too small for balance. The sight of them pulled Ethan from the fog of memory. He smiled faintly, an expression that looked almost foreign on his face, and said, "You two really don't know what kind of place you found." He carried them outside, letting them sniff the air. Both pups wandered straight to the sprout, circling it, tails wagging in short, uncertain arcs. Then in unison, they lay down beside it, as if the tiny stem radiated something invisible they understood better than he did. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into town for dog food and supplies. The roads were still half buried, and the few locals he passed gave the polite, measured nods small towns reserve for strangers. At the feed store, he met Tom Redding, a man in his 50s with a weathered face, the kind that looked carved by laughter and winters in equal measure. Tom wore a green flannel shirt under a heavy vest, his beard peppered with gray. "You must be the fella renting the old Miller cabin," he said, as Ethan paid for the bag of feed. "Didn't think anyone would last a winter up there alone. You hunt?" "Not anymore," Ethan said. His tone made Tom glance at him with the quick intuition of someone who'd seen grief before, but didn't ask questions. "Dogs, huh? Shepherd pups?" Tom added. "Strong breed. Loyal. Sometimes too smart for their own good." Ethan gave a short nod. "Yeah. Found them in the snow." Tom frowned. "Lucky they're alive. Around here, most things don't get second chances." Ethan didn't reply. When he returned home, dusk was settling, and smoke from the chimney coiled upward in soft gray threads. The cabin felt warmer now, alive with small sounds. The crackle of firewood, paws against the floor, the rustle of movement. He poured milk into a bowl, watched the pups lap it eagerly, then sat by the window, staring at the sprout outside. It seemed slightly taller already. He opened the drawer beside the table and took out a small metal box. Inside lay his own dog tag, scratched and dull beside Daniel's. He traced the engraved letters with his thumb. Hale, D, 1987-2010. The metal was cold enough to sting. He remembered the mission clearly. The explosion, the dust storm, the static in his radio. Daniel had pulled him behind a ridge seconds before the second blast. Ethan had lived. Daniel hadn't. For 12 years, that single act had sat inside him like an unhealed wound. He had brought back a handful of soil from the site and, one night, when whiskey made memory too loud, buried it by his porch. He hadn't thought of it since. Until now. In town, meanwhile, Margaret Hale sat at her kitchen table, a lamp casting soft amber light on a page of stationery. Her handwriting was neat, the looping cursive of a school teacher's hand. "My dear Daniel," she wrote, "the snow has come again, the same kind you used to chase with your boots when you were 10. The tree behind the house is sleeping now, but I know it will wake when spring comes. I'll write to you until it does." She folded the letter carefully, slid it into a tin box with others like it, and pulled on her coat. Outside, the air bit her cheeks, and the birch tree stood pale against the dark sky. She knelt, brushed snow from its base, and buried the letter there. For Margaret, the act wasn't superstition. It was conversation. She had no one left to talk to since her husband's heart gave out 5 years ago. But with the tree, she felt presence. The way its trunk creaked in the wind reminded her of her son's laughter. Sometimes, when the light hit its bark, she swore it gleamed like desert sand. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Inside Ethan's cabin, the pups stirred restlessly. Ash scratched at the door. River whimpered. Ethan sat up from bed, rubbing his eyes. The clock read 1:14 a.m. He opened the door to a blast of freezing air. The forest lay drowned in moonlight, every branch crystallized. The two dogs bounded out and ran straight to the tiny birch sprout. They lay down again beside it, ears twitching. Ethan followed, pulling on his coat. He crouched, his breath fogging. The snow around the sprout seemed to sink and shift, a faint warmth seeping through. He pressed his palm to the ground, then froze. There was movement beneath the soil, soft, rhythmic, like someone breathing. His pulse quickened. He knelt lower, ear almost to the ground, and for a fleeting second, he thought he heard it clearly. An exhale, slow and deep, as if the earth itself sighed. Ash gave a low growl. River answered with a short, mournful whine. Then both lifted their heads and began to howl, not loud, not fearful, but long and melodic, their voices rising into the empty woods. The sound echoed through the valley, a wild, ancient harmony that made Ethan's chest tighten. It wasn't the sharp cry of animals. It was closer to something human, something remembered. He looked up at the sky, scattered with stars so clear it hurt to see them. The world seemed to hold still between heartbeats. The sprout trembled, the snow around it melting slightly, revealing dark soil beneath. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "Daniel?" The name vanished into the cold. For a while he knelt there beside them, listening. The howling faded. replaced by the steady whisper of the wind through the pines. He stood at last, shoulders hunched, carrying the pups back inside. He placed them beside the stove, then sat down and stared into the fire until dawn began to gray the windows. Somewhere behind his ribs, he could still feel the echo of that breath beneath the roots, a reminder that silence is never truly empty, only waiting to be heard. The snow had begun to thaw along the main road to Haverhill when Ethan Cole decided to take the two puppies to the town's small veterinary clinic. Ash was growing stronger each day, already testing his teeth on the legs of chairs. But River had stopped eating the night before and trembled when he picked her up. The drive was slow. Meltwater streaked the windshield, and the snowbanks along the roadside gleamed under the late winter sun. The closer he got to town, the more he felt that subtle pressure he always did when leaving the solitude of his cabin. The feeling of being observed, even if no one was there. The clinic sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, a white cottage with green shutters and a hand-painted sign that read, Haverhill Animal Care. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and pine soap. A bell chimed as he entered. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 30s, petite, with a kind but brisk manner. Her name tag read Sarah McConnell. She had curly auburn hair tied back in a loose bun, a sprinkle of freckles across her pale skin, and eyes the shade of soft moss. She smiled automatically, the way someone does who's had to soothe both animals and anxious owners for years. "Hi there," she said. "Those two look like trouble. What's going on with them?" "Found them in the snow a few nights ago," Ethan said. "The small one's not eating." Sarah lifted River carefully from his arms, pressing her ear to the puppy's chest. "Heartbeat's strong," she murmured, checking her gums. "A little dehydrated, maybe chilled. You did well bringing her in." Her tone carried a quiet authority. "We'll warm her up, give her some fluids. Don't worry, soldier. She'll pull through." She said it without knowing, but the word soldier landed like a note struck on an old instrument. Ethan didn't answer, just nodded. The door behind the counter opened, and a gray-haired woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a towel. "Sarah, do we still have that small IV line for—" She stopped mid-sentence when her gaze met Ethan's. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The woman was tall, her posture straight despite her age, her hair silver white, cut neatly above the shoulders. Her eyes, a clear blue tinged with green, were the kind that held both warmth and restraint. Margaret Hale had been coming to this clinic for years, with stray cats and injured birds she nursed back to health. But she hadn't expected to see the name E. Cole on the appointment sheet Sarah had left on the desk. Ethan recognized her too. The memory of her face was faded, drawn from a photograph in Daniel Hale's locker. A younger version of this same woman, standing beside her son before he shipped out. "Mrs. Hale?" Ethan said quietly. She blinked. "You know my name?" He hesitated. "Daniel talked about you, a lot." The room seemed to shrink. Sarah glanced between them, sensing something private. I'll take the pup to the back," she said softly, and slipped away. Margaret's fingers tightened on the towel she still held. "You served with my son," she said, her voice even, though it trembled at the edges. "Yes," Ethan replied. She stepped closer, studying his face. The lines around his mouth, the streaks of gray in his beard, the steady but guarded posture. It all spoke of a man shaped by war, like a sculpture carved by loss more than time. "You were in the same unit? SEAL Team 5? He nodded once. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. You're the first man from that team I've met. No one ever told me much, only that Daniel didn't come home." Ethan looked at the floor, jaw tight. The words lodged somewhere behind his ribs. "He was a good man," he said. It was the safest truth he could offer. Margaret studied him for a moment, then said gently, "You were there, weren't you, when it happened?" He couldn't answer. His silence spoke enough. The air between them filled with everything unsaid. His guilt, her grief, 12 years of unasked questions. Finally, she turned toward the window. Outside, the sky had begun to gray again, snow starting to drift in thin veils. "My son used to say, the desert sand was the color of our birch trees in October," she murmured. "Strange thing to remember, isn't it?" Ethan swallowed. "He said that to me once too." She faced him again, eyes softer now. "You live near the woods north of town, don't you? The Miller place?" "Yes," she nodded. "I thought so. I saw you once in the market. You looked like someone who was trying very hard to disappear." He gave a wry smile. "That's about right." Margaret went to a small shelf behind the counter and took down a wooden box, no larger than a book. Its surface was smooth, the grain faintly shining from years of handling. "These belong to Daniel," she said, holding it out. "He sent them home before his last mission. I've kept them all this time, but I think they were meant for someone else." Ethan hesitated, staring at the box. "I can't..." She cut him off gently. "It's only a box of birch seeds. He collected them from the grove behind our house, said he wanted to plant them wherever he went, to leave something living in places that weren't." She smiled faintly. "Silly, I know." Ethan took the box, the weight feather-light yet heavy in meaning. "Thank you," he said. "Promise me you'll plant them somewhere they'll grow," she said. He always believed trees could remember kindness. Sarah returned then, holding River wrapped in a towel. "She'll be fine," she said. "Strong little heart." The puppy squirmed, licking Margaret's fingers. The older woman laughed softly, the sound rusty but real. "She likes you," Ethan said. "I've always had that effect on lost creatures," she replied with a gentle shrug. "You included, perhaps." When Ethan left, the sky was deepening to blue-gray. He placed the wooden box on the passenger seat beside Ash and River, who were already curled together, asleep. The drive back was quiet, the road stretching endlessly through the white fields. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he thought of Margaret's words. Plant them where they'll grow. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen. The wind had died down, and the forest was unnaturally still. Inside, he set the box on the table. The lid creaked as he opened it. Inside lay several small packets of birch seeds tied with a thin ribbon, and beneath them, folded neatly, a yellowed note written in a young man's handwriting. "Plant this where forgiveness can grow." Ethan sat back, staring at the words until they blurred. Forgiveness. He wasn't sure who it was for anymore. Daniel, himself, or the world that had kept turning after that day. Outside, the small birch sprout bent under the wind, its thin leaves trembling like something alive trying to remember how to breathe. The thaw came early that year, softening the frozen ground around Ethan Cole's cabin until the snow began to retreat in patches, revealing damp soil and the faint green promise of new life. The birch sapling that had sprouted weeks earlier now stood nearly 3 feet tall, far taller than any plant should have grown through a Vermont winter. Its bark had already begun to turn silvery white. veined with thin black scars, like ink lines on old parchment. Every morning, Ethan would find Ash and River lying quietly beside it, their bodies curved protectively around the young tree, as if guarding something sacred. He had noticed how they behaved when he approached to water it. Heads lifted, ears pricked, yet never growling, never moving away. It wasn't obedience, it was reverence. When he ran his fingers along the trunk, the air felt faintly charged, as though the tree itself breathed. That afternoon, a cold drizzle began to fall. Ethan pulled on his coat and stepped outside, bucket in hand. The dogs followed, tails wagging lightly. He poured water around the roots and knelt to check the soil. As he brushed away damp earth, his hand caught on something hard. A flash of metal gleamed through the mud. He froze. Slowly, he dug around it, revealing a small, rusted tag, oval, flat, and stamped with faint, familiar letters. Hale, D, OPOS, USN SEAL. Ethan's breath hitched. His stomach clenched so hard it hurt. The tag was old, the edges worn from time, yet the name was unmistakable. Daniel Hale. The same dog tag he'd believed lost during that last mission. The one he'd buried with the handful of desert soil months ago. He sat back on his heels, rain sliding down his face, mixing with the dirt on his hands. The birch tree swayed slightly in the wind, its thin branches trembling like something alive. Ethan looked at the tag, then at the tree. It couldn't be. And yet, somehow, it was. Ash barked once, sharply. River pressed closer to Ethan's leg, her body tense. He rubbed her head absent-mindedly, his thoughts spiraling through memory. That night in Helmand, the blast, the dust and screaming radio static, Daniel shouting, "Go, Ethan!" right before the world went white. He'd carried the tag home as if it were a piece of bone, a proof of loss. When he buried it with the soil, he'd thought it was his way of saying goodbye. Now it had come back to him through the roots of a tree that shouldn't exist. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Ethan cleaned the tag, wiping away mud with the edge of his shirt. Under the grime, the steel still shone faintly, the letters crisp. He set it on the table, beside the wooden box Margaret had given him. The note inside, "Plant this where forgiveness can grow," seemed to whisper from the paper. He didn't believe in signs, not really, but this felt like one. Meanwhile, in town, Margaret Hale lay in bed listening to the wind. Her house, small and old but tidy, smelled faintly of cedar and tea leaves. She had fallen asleep with a book open on her chest, a volume of Frost's poems she'd read 100 times before. When the storm rolled in after midnight, she began to dream. In her dream, the snow came down heavy, swirling like white ash. Through it, a figure emerged, a young man in uniform, his hair damp, his face lit by a strange, silvery glow. He stood beneath a birch tree that gleamed brighter than moonlight, every branch trembling with wind that didn't reach the ground. The man smiled, not sorrowfully, but with peace, as though the burden of distance had lifted. Then, as the snow thinned, he faded into the light, leaving only the sound of a heartbeat beneath the earth. Margaret woke with tears on her cheeks. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock and the distant cry of an owl. She sat up, pressing a hand to her chest. For years, she had prayed to dream of her son, not in pain or fear, but whole. She had never succeeded until tonight. And though she couldn't explain it, she felt sure it meant something had changed. Somewhere, a door had been opened. The next morning, she walked out to her backyard, her boots sinking in soft mud. The birch tree there, Her birch seemed taller, its bark paler. She touched its trunk, whispering, "Daniel." The wind stirred, and a few flakes of melting snow drifted down, landing softly on her sleeve. By late afternoon, the rain turned to mist, and the forest behind Ethan's cabin filled with low, whispering fog. He had spent the day pacing the small living room, unable to sit still. The dog tag lay on the table where he can see it. Its presence filled the cabin more than the fire's warmth or the dog's quiet breathing. As dusk fell, Ethan finally made a decision. He dressed, slipped the tag into his coat pocket, and stepped outside. The road into town was slick with melting snow, but the drive felt shorter than usual, as if the distance between guilt and courage had finally narrowed. Margaret's house stood on the edge of Haverhill, framed by dark pines. A single light glowed through the front window. Ethan parked by the curb, heart pounding, and walked up the steps. He hesitated before knocking, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. Then he lifted his hand and rapped once. Inside, Margaret stirred from her chair by the fireplace. She wasn't expecting visitors and rarely had any. When she opened the door, the porch light caught the lines of her face, the calm gravity of someone who'd waited too long for closure but never stopped believing it might come. Ethan stood there, silent for a moment. Then he held out his hand. In it lay the dog tag, shining faintly in the lamplight. Margaret's breath caught. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the metal. "Where did you—" "I found it," Ethan said softly, "near my cabin, buried under the birch." The two of them stood there in the doorway, the night pressing close around them, the air smelling of wet leaves and wood smoke. The tag glinted once in the yellow light, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to hesitate between past and present, between what was buried and what still lived. Neither spoke again, but both felt it. The quiet, impossible recognition that something long held in silence had finally risen to the surface. The storm returned without warning, thick, relentless, and loud enough to swallow every other sound. Snow lashed against the windows of Margaret Hale's small house as she stood across from Ethan Cole, the man who had just handed her back her son's dog tag. The light from the oil lamp flickered between them, painting shifting gold lines across her face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Margaret's hand still trembled as she held the cold piece of metal that had once rested against Daniel's chest. Ethan's shoulders were rigid beneath his coat. He looked older under the lamplight, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes carved deeper by exhaustion. He had come to return what he'd found, but now that it was done, he didn't know what to say. Margaret broke the silence first. "You were there, weren't you?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind outside. Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes." She studied his face, as if searching for her son somewhere in its angles. "He saved you," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Ethan's jaw worked before he could speak. "It should have been me. I was the one who saw the blast coming. He pulled me back. The second explosion—" He stopped. The words choked him like smoke. Margaret reached out, touching the dog tag with her fingertips. "You've been carrying this guilt since that day?" He nodded, eyes lowered. "Every morning since." For a moment, only the storm answered. Then Margaret stepped closer. Her face was pale but calm, her silver hair lit by the trembling flame behind her. "If my son were here," she said, her voice steady, "he wouldn't want you to keep dying for him. He would want you to keep living." The wind outside rose into a low, keening sound, as if echoing her words. Ethan blinked hard, the muscles in his jaw softening for the first time. From the corner of the room, Ash barked sharply. River followed, pacing near the door. Both dogs pressed their noses to the floorboards, whining. Margaret frowned. What's wrong with them? Ethan glanced toward the window. The storm had grown fiercer, the snow swirling like ghosts under the streetlight. They want out, he said. They've been like this before, when the birch started growing. Margaret grabbed her coat. Then let's see what they're trying to show us. They stepped outside, the cold biting instantly through their layers. The wind screamed across the field, driving sharp snow into their faces. The two dogs bounded ahead, vanishing into the swirling white, their fur barely visible except for flashes of movement. Ethan shouted after them, his voice lost in the storm, and followed with Margaret close behind. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows. Branches whipped in the wind, creaking under the weight of ice. The snow was nearly knee-deep now. Ethan shielded Margaret with his arm as they trudged forward, the dogs' barks guiding them deeper until they reached a clearing half buried in snowdrifts. There, through the storm, Ethan saw it, a small birch tree, nearly identical to the one that had grown outside his cabin. Its thin trunk was half bent under the wind, but its leaves, impossible for this season, still clung to the branches, fluttering like pale wings. Around its base, the snow was melted away, exposing dark soil that seemed to breathe faintly in the storm's rhythm. Margaret stopped, her eyes wide. "There's no way this could be here," she whispered. Ethan moved closer, his breath visible in the cold air. The dogs circled the young birch, whining softly, their bodies tense yet reverent, as though recognizing something sacred. He knelt beside it, pressing a hand to the ground, and felt it again, that faint pulse, steady and alive. The soil was warm, even as the snow fell around them. Margaret stepped forward, her coat whipping in the wind. "Do you feel it?" Ethan nodded slowly. "It's the same, like the one at the cabin." She looked at him, her expression a strange blend of grief and wonder. "Maybe the earth remembers," she said quietly. "Maybe it's been trying to tell you both something all along." Ethan stared at the fragile tree struggling against the storm. What could it be saying? Margaret's eyes glistened. "That forgiveness doesn't grow in sunlight. It grows in the cold, in the places we think nothing can survive." A gust of wind tore through the clearing then, strong enough to force them both to crouch. The birch swayed violently, snow spiraling around them like white fire. River barked in alarm. Ash pressed close against Ethan's leg. Margaret clung to her hood, voice nearly drowned by the gale. "Ethan," she shouted, "if my son could speak to you now, he would say, 'Stop running.'" He looked up, the storm blurring her figure through a veil of snow. "I don't know how." "Start by not being afraid of remembering," she cried. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The wind, the sound, even the trembling of the branches. Ethan's breath came ragged as he reached out and touched the young birch's trunk. Its bark was warm, pulsing faintly against his palm. He closed his eyes. Images flooded his mind. Daniel laughing in the barracks, passing him a canteen under a blazing desert sun, saying, "If one of us doesn't make it, you live twice as hard for both of us." When Ethan opened his eyes again, the wind had softened. Snowflakes drifted gently now, no longer cutting like knives. The clearing glowed faintly with reflected moonlight. The second birch stood upright again, defying the storm. Ethan fell to his knees beside the dogs, wrapping his arms around them. They pressed close to him, their bodies trembling, not from fear, but from the cold and something unspoken, a shared knowing. "I hear you," he whispered, eyes on the birch. "I'm done hiding." Margaret stood a few steps away, her hair whipped free from her hood, tears freezing on her cheeks. She looked at Ethan, the man her son had saved, and saw not the soldier who'd carried guilt, but the one who had finally begun to set it down. In the distance, thunder rumbled softly, then faded into silence. Ethan bowed his head against the wind and whispered, barely audible, "I won't run anymore." The two dogs lifted their muzzles and howled, their voices mingling with the sigh of the wind through the trees. The sound rose high and long, neither mournful nor triumphant, only human in its longing, as the snow kept falling and the birch trees stood witness beneath the storm. The morning after the storm, the world was quiet again, eerily so. Ethan Cole stepped outside his cabin to find the forest glistening under a fragile layer of ice, every branch heavy, every sound muffled. The air carried the scent of cold bark and thawing earth. Snow still clung to the roof, dripping slowly into the slush below. He looked toward the birch tree. It was broken. The trunk had snapped clean in two about 4 feet from the ground, leaving the upper half leaning awkwardly against a nearby pine. Its white bark was split open, revealing the pale flesh beneath, like a wound that refused to close. The roots, however, remained anchored. Ethan crouched beside it, brushing away the crusted snow from the base. The soil there was still faintly warm, alive. Behind him, Ash and River padded through the snow, sniffing around the fallen half of the tree. River whimpered once, and Ash barked as if scolding the wind. Ethan sighed, running a gloved hand down the jagged break. "It's done," he muttered. "There's no saving it now." He went inside for his axe. By the time he returned, Margaret Hale was already walking up the path, her boots leaving narrow prints in the fresh snow. She wore a long wool coat, buttoned to her throat, and a knitted scarf, the color of ash bark. Despite her age, her stride was steady. She must have walked all the way from town. When she reached the tree, she stopped beside Ethan. Her gaze lingered on the broken trunk, then moved to the axe in his hand. "Don't," she said simply. Ethan frowned. "It's dying." Margaret shook her head. "Not everything that breaks is dead. Sometimes it's just waiting to see if anyone still believes it's worth saving." The words stilled him. He lowered the axe. She knelt beside the tree, touching the exposed bark gently. Her fingers traced the edge of the break, as if reading a wound's history. "When Daniel was 10, she said quietly, he broke his arm falling from a tree in our backyard. The doctors said he'd heal, but he refused to let me touch the cast for weeks. He thought it would never work again, but when it came off, it was stronger than before." Ethan glanced at her, then back to the tree. "You think I can fix this?" "I think you can try," she said, standing. "And maybe that's what matters." Ethan didn't answer. But that afternoon, he found himself sawing 2 wooden planks from the shed and lashing them against the split trunk to hold it upright. He tied the broken half to the lower stump with thick rope, steadying it like a soldier setting a fallen comrade back on his feet. Ash lay beside him the entire time, ears perked. River dug at the snow around the roots, as if clearing space for air. When it was done, the birch stood crooked but whole again, its pale skin wrapped in rough cords. You've seen worse, Ethan murmured, patting its side. So have I. As the day faded, a small car crunched up the snowy road. Margaret turned at the sound, smiling faintly. That'll be Emma, she said. Ethan watched as the car door opened and a young woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 20s, her features a softer echo of Margaret's. High cheekbones, sharp gray-blue eyes. Her brown hair, streaked lightly with gold, was tucked beneath a knitted cap. She wore a long camel coat and carried a leather satchel slung across her shoulder. "This is my niece, Emma," Margaret said. "She's visiting for a few days." Emma extended a hand to Ethan, her grip firm but warm. "You must be the Navy SEAL who lives out here," she said, her tone gentle but curious. Ethan blinked, half amused. "That's one way to put it." She smiled slightly. "Aunt Margaret told me you've got 2 dogs who guard a tree like it's holy ground. I had to see that for myself." Ethan looked toward Ash and River, both now dozing under the patched birch. "They're strange that way." Emma crouched beside them, her eyes softening. Or maybe they just know what's worth protecting. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a small notebook and a pen. "I write for a local magazine. I think there's something here. A story about what refuses to die, even when the world says it should." Ethan stiffened. "You're not here to write about me." She looked up, meeting his gaze evenly. "No, I'm here to write about survival. You just happen to be part of it." Margaret smiled approvingly from the porch. "She has a way of finding meaning in the cracks," she said. "Maybe she gets it from me." They shared dinner that evening, soup and bread by the fire. Emma listened quietly as Margaret spoke about Daniel, about the birch trees they had planted when he was a boy. Ethan said little, though occasionally he caught Emma watching him, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying. When the wind picked up again outside, she stood by the window, looking at the tree bound in rope and shadow. "You really think it'll live?" she asked softly. Ethan shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I just couldn't leave it broken." Emma smiled faintly. "That's what my editor calls stubborn hope." Later that night, after Margaret and Emma had returned to town, Ethan stepped outside again. The moon had risen, bright enough to cast long silver lines across the snow. The birch stood motionless, its bindings creaking softly in the cold. The air was still except for the faint, rhythmic breathing of the 2 dogs sleeping beneath it. Ethan knelt beside them, brushing his hand across River's fur. "Keep watch," he whispered. "You're better at that than I ever was." As he turned to go, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He leaned closer to the tree. From the edge of the break, where the wood had split, a tiny green bud had begun to form, no larger than a tear, trembling under the moonlight. Ethan stared, half in disbelief, half in awe. "You're not done yet," he murmured. Ash stirred, lifting his head. River shifted in her sleep, one paw resting lightly against the base of the tree. The moonlight caught their breath, rising like smoke from the past. The night was silent again, but not empty. Beneath the silver light, the broken birch held on. By the time spring arrived, the forest around Ethan Cole's cabin had transformed. The snow that once blanketed everything in silence was retreating into the shadows, and the ground, dark, rich, and breathing, had begun to reveal what it had kept hidden through winter. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and damp soil. The birch tree that had once split and nearly died now stood upright, still supported by its wooden brace, but alive, its branches tipped with the soft green buds of early bloom. Ethan had changed too. The heaviness in his chest, that constant pulse of guilt, had softened into something quieter, like a scar that no longer hurt but still remembered. He had started visiting Margaret Hale more often, drawn not only by the quiet peace of her home, but by her stories, the way she spoke of her son without bitterness. Her garden behind the small yellow house was waking from winter's sleep. Patches of melting snow, damp leaves, and a single white birch tree standing at the edge of the fence. Its trunk was thicker, its roots deep and wide, the same tree Daniel had planted with her when he was a boy. Margaret was out there that morning, her back slightly stooped, her gray hair tied in a loose bun. She wore a long brown cardigan over a faded blue dress, her sleeves rolled up as she brushed the last of the leaves away from the roots. Her hands were thin but steady, movements deliberate and almost ceremonial. Ethan joined her, carrying a small trowel and a tin of soil from his cabin. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. Margaret smiled, faint and warm. "I've been tending this garden for 40 years, Ethan, but company doesn't hurt." They worked in silence for a while. The earth was soft, damp under their hands. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice was low, reflective. "When Daniel was a boy, he used to bury letters here, little scraps of paper folded into the soil, things he couldn't say out loud." Ethan paused, looking at her. "You ever read them?" She shook her head. "Not until now." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box wrapped in oilcloth. "I dug them up last week. I thought maybe we could read them together. I think he'd like that." They sat beneath the birch tree, the sunlight filtering through its young leaves. Margaret opened the box and took out the letters, most written in a child's careful hand, others in the neat, angular script of a young soldier. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, but the ink was still strong. Ethan listened as she read aloud. Notes about his first dog, the day he enlisted, and one letter addressed simply, "To whoever I leave behind." Margaret's voice trembled only once. "If I don't come home, don't be sad. Plant something instead. A tree, maybe. Something that grows where I can't." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. The words felt like they were meant for both of them. After a long silence, he said softly, "He got his tree." Margaret smiled, her eyes wet. "He got two." At that moment, Ash and River bounded into the yard, their coats glistening in the sun. They had grown in the months since Ethan found them. Taller, stronger, but still with the same mismatched personalities. Ash was bold and restless, always the first to explore. River was calm and observant, following quietly, but never far behind. They lay down under the birch, tails thumping against the soil, as if they understood the solemnity of the moment. Margaret reached down to scratch River behind the ear. "They remind me of soldiers," she said, "always guarding something invisible." Ethan nodded. "They know things we don't." A car pulled up by the front gate, its tires crunching over the gravel. Emma stepped out, her long hair caught by the breeze, sunlight catching the golden strands. She wore a white linen shirt rolled at the sleeves and dark jeans tucked into boots. Her satchel hung across her body, heavier than before. She waved as she walked up the path. "I brought something," she said, smiling. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You didn't bring your editor, did you?" Emma laughed. "No, just this." She handed Ethan a large brown envelope tied with string. The article's finished, but I'm not publishing it." Ethan looked at her, puzzled. "Why not?" "Because it's not really a story for strangers," she said softly. "It's for the people who lived it." She hesitated, then added, "I thought you should have it." He untied the string and unfolded the pages. Her writing was simple, precise, but full of empathy. She had written about the broken birch that refused to die, about the man who couldn't forgive himself, and about 2 dogs who guarded what they couldn't explain. At the bottom of the last page, a line in her handwriting read, "Some memories are meant to grow quietly." Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. "Thank you." Emma smiled gently. "It's not a thank you story, Ethan. It's a remembering one." The rest of the afternoon passed in calm, unhurried rhythm. Margaret watered the garden while Ethan stacked old soil pots, and Emma took photos of the birch tree, its bark smooth and luminous against the blue sky. At one point, Ethan noticed the older woman burying the last of Daniel's letters back under the roots. When he asked why, she said, "Because I finally understand what he meant. We don't plant memories to keep them. We plant them so they can keep us." Ethan thought about that as he walked home later. The air was warm now, filled with the dripping sound of melting snow. His own birch tree shimmered in the late light, its trunk crooked but alive. The wooden brace was still in place, but it seemed to need it less now. He reached down, pressing his palm to the bark. The tree's surface was rough, cool, but pulsing faintly beneath. The same heartbeat he'd felt months ago. Ash and River curled beside it, their eyes half closed. Across town, Margaret stepped out onto her porch, just as the sun dipped low. The birch in her yard glowed gold in the fading light. Then something caught her eye. The branches, still young and slender, were blooming. Tiny white catkins trembling like snowflakes reborn. She smiled. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the echo of another heartbeat, one she hadn't felt since Daniel's last letter arrived all those years ago. The next morning, Ethan awoke to find the same miracle had reached his cabin. His birch, too, had flowered overnight, pale blossoms opening against the dawn. When Margaret visited later that day, she looked between the 2 trees, the one planted in her garden and the one he had saved, and said, almost to herself, "We've let memory live, not to haunt us, but to remind us what still can." The dogs lay quietly between them, their heads resting on their paws, the wind moving softly through the leaves that now whispered like a prayer fulfilled. A full year had passed since the winter that changed everything. The cabin at the edge of the Vermont woods now stood surrounded by green instead of white, its roof dotted with fallen birch leaves rather than snow. Ethan Cole sat on the porch steps with a carving knife in his hand, the air warm enough to taste summer. Ash and River, no longer puppies, but full-grown German shepherds, their coats thick and glinting bronze under sunlight, lay nearby, panting softly after chasing each other along the stream. The birch tree in front of the cabin had grown taller, stronger, its trunk scarred but proud. The rope that once bound its broken halves was gone. Only a faint groove remained where it had healed around the wound. Ethan traced the marks in the wood with a thumb, remembering every storm that had passed since. Every night he'd stood outside, listening to the wind move through its branches. He leaned forward, pressing the knife gently into the bark. The sound of the blade was soft and rhythmic. Scrape, pause, scrape. He wasn't carving for beauty. He was carving for memory. Slowly, the letters began to form. Daniel Hale, He stopped halfway, breathing deep. This wasn't a memorial. It was something else. An acknowledgement. A seed. Ash rose and came to sit beside him, tilting his head. River stayed near the base of the tree, resting her muzzle on her paws, eyes half closed. Ethan smiled faintly. "He'd like you to," he said. "He always had a thing for strays." The sound of gravel crunching made him turn. Emma Hale stepped out of her car, her hair tied loosely behind her, a notebook tucked under her arm. She looked different now, less like a reporter, more like someone who had learned to listen to silence. She waved. "I figured you'd still be out here." Ethan stood, brushing bark dust from his hands. "You're early." Emma smiled. "I wanted to bring something. It's from Margaret." The mention of her aunt's name hit gently, like a soft bruise pressed by memory. Margaret Hale had passed quietly 2 months earlier, in her sleep, at home. No drama, no pain, just a quiet departure, like the last page of a story turning itself. Ethan hadn't gone to the funeral. He couldn't. But the day after, he had walked out to the birch tree and stood beneath it for hours, listening. The wind had moved through the branches like a whisper he could almost understand. Emma held out an envelope, its paper worn and faintly yellowed. "I found this on her writing desk. It was addressed to you." Ethan hesitated, then took it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Strong, looping, steady. He sat on the porch steps again, tearing the envelope carefully along the seam. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. "Dear Ethan, if you're reading this, it means the seasons have turned again, and I've gone where Daniel already waits. Don't be sad. I had enough time to see what needed to be seen. When you hear the wind through the birch, that's him saying thank you. You gave his memory roots, not a grave. Keep tending to what grows. Margaret." Ethan read the lines twice before folding the letter and slipping it back into its envelope. His throat burned, but he didn't fight it. Emma sat beside him, silent for a while. "She talked about you a lot," she said softly. "Said you reminded her that even broken things can still make shade." Ethan smiled faintly. She had a way with words. "She did," Emma agreed, glancing toward the tree. "You know, the one in her garden's blooming again. My mom says it's the fullest it's been in years." He nodded, eyes on the carving in the bark. "Maybe they're talking to each other." Emma didn't laugh. She just looked at the wind moving the branches and said, "Maybe they are." Later that evening, as the sun sank low, the sky deepened into amber and lilac. Ethan sat with the dogs near the tree, a mug of coffee in hand, while the woods hummed softly with crickets and wind. The light caught the scars on the birch, turning them silver. He thought about the years he'd lost, buried under guilt, silence, and survival. About the missions that never left him, the faces that never faded. But for the first time in memory, those ghosts no longer demanded to be fed. They just were, like shadows that had learned to rest. Ash stood and walked to the edge of the path, looking toward the forest trail. River followed, glancing back at Ethan as if to say, "Come on." He smiled, finishing his coffee and setting the cup down. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see where it goes." The three of them walked down the dirt path, the forest stretching out before them in soft evening light. The birch behind them rustled in the wind, its leaves trembling like small, quiet applause. When Ethan stopped at the ridge where the trees opened into a wide clearing, he turned to look back. The breeze carried the sound of the birch leaves all the way to where he stood. A faint, rhythmic whisper, almost like breathing. He lifted his face to the wind. There were no miracles now, no visions or voices, just the sound of life continuing. Trees swaying, dogs padding softly through the grass, the steady pulse of the earth below. He let the silence wash over him. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was something else, something alive. The birch tree swayed once more, a soft white figure against the horizon, and as the wind moved through its leaves, Ethan thought he heard a single word in its rhythm. "Thank you." He smiled, resting a hand on each dog's head. "Yeah," he whispered. "You're welcome." Then he turned back toward the path, and together they kept walking through the whispering woods, toward whatever waited beyond the trees. In a world that often feels too heavy, this story reminds us that miracles aren't always flashes of light or sudden rescues. They're quiet things. A tree that heals after breaking. A man who forgives himself. Two lives once lost finding warmth again. God's grace often moves like that. Unseen, patient, growing in the soil of our pain until one day we look up and realize the branches have begun to bloom. If you've ever carried something too heavy to name, remember, no wound is too deep for renewal, and no winter lasts forever. God plants his miracles in silence, waiting for us to believe enough to notice. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that grace still lives among us. May God bless you, and may his mercy find you wherever you are tonight.